Keir Starmer tonight blamed Boris Johnson for letting down the British people over the coronavirus crisis. In a rare televised address to the nation, the Labour leader slammed the failure of government since the pandemic erupted. 6 months after the government introduced the first round of lockdown measures, Mr Starmer claimed the latest had not been inevitable. The Prime Minister has warned that the country will face a second national lockdown if new coronavirus curbs are flouted. He suggested freedom-loving Brits were behind the new spike rather than confusion, lack of trust in the government or the testing shambles. But Mr Starmer told the public, the return of this virus and the return of restrictions are not an act of God. They're a failure of government. The British people have done everything asked of them. But I'm afraid the government has not, he added. We're a great country. We shouldn't have one of the highest death rates in the world, or one of the worst recessions. It's a national scandal that we still don't have a testing system that works, or a plan to protect our care homes. It shouldn't be like this. The new measures mean office staff in England have been again told to work from home, facemasks will become more widespread, and a 10 p.m. curfew will be enforced on pubs and restaurants. But the government's own scientific advisors have warned that they do not go far enough to halt the spread of the disease. The UK recorded 6,178 new coronavirus cases today, which is close to the highest ever daily total recorded in early May. Earlier at PMQs, Mr Starmer accused the PM of pretending there isn't a problem with the government's COVID testing system. Ahead of the launch 3 months later than promised of the NHS tracing app, Mr Starmer said parents were desperately trying to get tests for the kids. He highlighted figures showing 1 in 8 children were off school this week, adding, "How on earth did we get into this mess?" Accusing the PM of being out of touch with the experiences of parents with school-age children, the Labour leader warned that kids being off class disrupts their education. He added, "The reality is losing control of testing is a major reason why the Prime Minister is losing control of this virus." Close quote. But the PM pleaded, "We are doing our level best to get every child a test who has symptoms, and further to that, thanks to the efforts of teachers in this country, of parents, pupils, 99.9% of our schools are now back." Coronavirus outbreak. Mr Johnson has come under pressure from his Chancellor, Tory MPs and business groups not to risk further economic devastation. Rishi Sunak has scrapped this autumn's budget and is announcing the government's plans on Thursday to support workers through a hard winter after the furlough scheme winds up. But his scientific advisors want him to go further. SAGE member Professor John Edmunds called for tougher measures as fast as possible, such as a ban on 2 households gathering. He warned, "I suspect we will see very stringent measures coming in place throughout the UK at some point, but it will be too late again. We didn't act quick enough in March. We haven't learned from our mistake back then. Unfortunately, we're about to repeat it." Another SAGE member, Professor Peter Penshaw, from Imperial College London, said that waiting just 2 or 3 weeks would be too late. Asked if the measures had gone far enough, he said, "I think looking from the lens of somebody who is concerned about health, probably not." Close quote. He added, We do know that the major transmission events are happening indoors in situations where maybe there's poor ventilation and you can't observe proper separation of 2 meters. It is clear. It came amid reports that Chief Medical Advisor Chris Whitty privately warned the PM that further restrictions in England, including a households mixing ban, were inevitable to bring the epidemic under control. But the science chief accepted that it was reasonable for Mr Johnson to try more limited measures first to protect the economy. It is understood that Sage had not modelled the impact of the 10 p.m. curfew, with members suggesting there was no evidence it would be effective. A Number 10 spokesman said, "There are also scientists on the other side of the argument saying that we have gone too far." Close quote. Over 13 meters people across the north, the Midlands, Scotland and Wales are already living with tougher local restrictions. Mr Johnson stopped short of banning meetups between different households nationwide in the new coronavirus restrictions on Tuesday. But Downing Street has signalled that more areas could be subject to the restriction after the PM came under pressure to harden curbs. Asked if the policy might be applied nationally, the PM spokesman said, "We have the powers to apply that locally." A very significant number of people are under that restriction already, and obviously, if it were to be required in other hotspot areas, then it's a tool we have at our disposal. Close quote. Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab warned that, if cases continued to soar, the measures could get more intrusive, or we could end up in a national lockdown. That is what we want to avoid. The government has to wait around 2 weeks to see if the current measures are working before deciding whether to introduce any more. In a BBC interview, Mr Starmer defended his remarks. Mr Johnson was not up to the job in his conference speech earlier this week. Character matters in a moment like this, more than perhaps than in other times, because everybody is vested on whether the government gets it right and succeeds, whether it is on the health front, worried about themselves and their families, or whether it is on the economy and jobs. I don't think he has got the right character for this, and I don't think he is up to it. Close quote. A YouGov poll found that 78% of people supported the measures already announced, although 45% said Mr Johnson should have gone further, while 32% said he had got the restrictions about right. Read Keir Starmer's address in full below. "When I was elected leader of the Labour Party, I said I would always act in the national interest. That's why, as the nation continues to fight against this dreadful virus, my priority will always be the same as yours: to save lives and protect our NHS." Sadly, despite all the sacrifices and heroism of the British people, it's clear we are not through this yet. The picture presented by the government's medical advisors this week was stark and clear. Infections are rising, hospital admissions are increasing, and we know from bitter experience where that could lead. That's why the government had to introduce further restrictions last night. We support this. And I urge everyone to follow the new guidance and the rule of law. While these restrictions are now necessary, they were not inevitable. The return of this virus and the return of restrictions are not an act of God. They're a failure of government. The British people have done everything asked of them. But I'm afraid the government has not. We're a great country. We shouldn't have one of the highest death rates in the world, or one of the worst recessions. It's a national scandal that we still don't have a testing system that works, or a plan to protect our care homes. It shouldn't be like this. People shouldn't have to travel hundreds of miles to get a test for their child, for themselves, or for their relatives. And we should be able to give our older people the dignity, security and respect they deserve. The government needs to fix testing fast, because that's the only way we can get control of the virus and prevent further restrictions. And we also need a plan B for the economy too. Because it makes no sense to bring in new restrictions at the same time as phasing out support for jobs and businesses. There was nothing in the Prime Minister's statement last night to protect people's jobs, businesses or our town centres and high streets. No clarity about what happens when the furlough scheme ends. That's a huge gap. It's a huge mistake, and it could lead to a wave of job losses this winter. We need a national effort to protect jobs and prevent a second lockdown. So I've offered to work with Prime Minister to do whatever we can to save lives and livelihoods. That offer remains open. My door is always open. The weeks and months ahead will be difficult. And I know there is real frustration and anger at the mistakes that the government has made in the last few months. But we will get through this. The darkness will lift. A better future is possible for our country. A country built on the values that have held us together during this pandemic. Decency, fairness, opportunity, compassion, and security. A future where Britain is everything it can be. The best place to grow up in and the best place to grow old inches. That's the future I want for my children and for my country. That's why I do this. Together, we can build it.